Yay.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Awesome Women podcast, except today it's on Zoom, so bear with us. Awesome Women is about empowering, supporting and connecting autistic women. Here with Nat, a third-year psychology student, an autistic woman and founder of Awesome Women in Australia. In today's podcast, I interview Yenn Purkis. Yenn Purkis is an author, public servant and passionate advocate for autistic people and their families. Yenn is the author of many books about autism. They also co-authored The Guide to Good Mental Health on the Autism Spectrum and The Parent's Practical Guide to Resilience for Children aged 2 to 10 on the Autism Spectrum. Yenn has also contributed to other books, journals, blogs and websites. Yenn has a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, which is now referred to as autism, and atypical schizophrenia. Yenn has been working full-time for the Australian Public Service since 2007. In between writing and paid work, they frequently give talks about living well with autism and mental illness. Yenn gave a presentation on autism and resilience at the TedX Canberra conference in 2013, and they also facilitate a support group for women on the autism spectrum and have their own internet radio show entitled Yenn's Autism Show. Yenn lives in Canberra with their little black kitty. And Yenn also has a Facebook page, Yenn Purkis Neurodiversity page, and has daily Yenn affirmations, Yenn for the day, which I love. Hi Yenn, how are you today?
Hi there, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your program.
That's okay. Thank you so much for joining me. I guess firstly, could you explain to listeners who don't know or want further clarification what identifying as a non-binary means, and you also using the pronouns they and them?
Yes, so my whole life I was considered female and I didn't feel female, I didn't feel male. I felt like a sort of third option. I felt like in terms of gender, I wasn't quite what people expected. And I never felt comfortable as a girl. And when I was a teenager, I used to have a shaved head and I'd wear flannelette shirts and boots and all that kind of thing. And so that was really my gender expression, I suppose. But back when I was a teenager and a young adult, we didn't have any language around gender diversity, really. I mean, there were transgender people, but that was very uncommon and people didn't know much about it. So it never occurred to me that there was something to describe how I felt about my gender. But as time went on, I was talking in the sort of mid 2015, 2016, that sort of time, I was talking to transgender and autistic friends, and we got talking about gender identity. And I realised that there actually was a community for me, and that being non-binary was a thing. And so in 2018, I came out as non-binary at the age of 44. Actually 43, it was just before my birthday. And it was utterly liberating. I felt like my life made sense. I understood who I was, and I do use pronouns of they them because for me I'm not male and I'm not female. I am a sort of different option, and so to say he or she to describe me is not correct, and does not actually accurately describe who I am. I also changed my name in 2019, which was utterly liberating. It was one of the best things that ever happened in my life. I love my Yenski name. It's the best name. I'm very proud of it. I came up with it myself. People say, oh, where's your name from? I said, it's from my name. And it actually has a meaning. It has a few meanings. So in poetry, to yearn is to yen, and I've made a career of oversharing and talking about myself and reflecting on who I am and identity and things like that. So I think yen's very appropriate in a poetic sense. It's also nice because it's a nod to my old name. It's got shares a number of letters with my old name, so it's like sort of acknowledging history without being history. And also in Australia, at least, it's quite a gender neutral name. It's very funny. Often when I go to the doctors or something like that, and I'm in the waiting room, they come out and you can see them looking around to think, which one of these people is Yenn? Is it a boy? Is it a girl? What is it? So I do think that's quite wonderful. It does amuse me quite a lot. So yeah, that's just very briefly my gender identity. My dad, who is lovely, and everyone loves my dad, he said to me, we were talking about my gender, and I hadn't really talked with my parents much about gender because they are quite, they're quite Christian, and I didn't want to get into a difficult conversation, so I sort of let it go for a bit. They're not in the least bit judgmental or rude, I should say, but I was a bit worried. But I got into a conversation about gender with my dad a few months ago, and he said, since I've come out, I've been noticeably happier. Like it's actually changed the way I engage with the world.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's lovely.
Oh, that's really good. Thank you so much for explaining about that. Because I think, you know, a lot of the older generation, they are probably, you know, not sure because, you know, back when they were younger, like you say, it wasn't really a thing back then, or people didn't kind of identify as non-binary. So yeah, that's really good. Thank you so much, Yenn. So before we delve into all the amazing work that you do, can you share with us a little about a bit about your own autistic journey and mental health issues?
So I was diagnosed as autistic when I was 20. That was in, I'm going to tell you my age now, that was in 1994. And that was the first year that Asperger's, or what would now be called autism level 1, was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, the DSM. So I was diagnosed. I was one of the first people, adults particularly, diagnosed in Australia. It was a long time ago. Nobody knew anything about autism. I actually didn't accept the diagnosis for another 7 years, and there were reasons for that. For me, it was very personal. It was very raw. I thought it was a justification of what the bullies had said to me in school, and all the insults that they'd given me. I thought it was actually a diagnosis of nerd, and I really didn't want it, and I really wasn't comfortable with it. In fact, I couldn't watch a documentary about autism without being very, very uncomfortable, and it was not something I wanted any part of. So it really took me to get to a place where I was more comfortable with myself and could accept that diagnosis and think, actually, that's me. But it didn't, I mean, I'm an advocate. I've been an advocate for over 15 years. And people probably wouldn't believe this about me, but I was quite ashamed of being autistic. In fact, for many years, I was less ashamed that I'd been in prison than that I was autistic. So it was really quite a difficult journey for me. And in terms of mental health, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1995. So that period of history was, you know, obviously the time to give Yenn diagnoses. I also didn't accept the schizophrenia diagnosis, basically because I didn't understand what it meant. And I didn't know, I knew people who had schizophrenia and they didn't seem to be like me.
Yes.
So I thought it must be wrong.
Yep.
And then I've learned since then that schizophrenia is a pretty broad church. You know, there's a lot of different elements to it. My specific diagnosis now is schizoaffective disorder, which is basically schizophrenia with a side order of mood issues, basically. So usually depression for me, also mania. I have been manic on a few occasions. It's generally really lovely, actually, but not very healthy. You can spend a lot of money when you're manic. But yes, so the autism, so my neurological diagnosis and my mental health diagnosis. I also have a diagnosis of ADHD, which is a much more recent thing, and that's from 2019, I think, was diagnosed. So I do find when I meet autistic people who also have ADHD, that we get along really well. I think it is I do tend to think it's a separate neurotype of sort of autism plus ADHD, because I do find when I meet people with those two, you know, descriptors, that we do get along very, very well together, and we have a lot of fellow feeling.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. So I'd love to learn more about your advocacy work. Can you tell me a little bit about this? And how you go about it.
So I've identified as an advocate since 2005, which was when my first book, called Finding a Different Kind of Normal, which is an autobiography, it was accepted for publication in 2005. And as soon as that happened, all these people wanted me to talk about my journey as an autistic person. And so for some years, I did a lot of talks to schools, to parent organizations, people like that. And it was all about my life story. It wasn't really, technical information about topics and things like that. It was talking about me. And so I felt that was I didn't mind doing that, but I actually didn't become a passionate advocate until 2012. When 2012, I met a young man on the autism spectrum, and he was very limited, not by his autism so much as by people's low expectations of his capability. And when I told him I was a public servant, that I was autistic and I'd written a book, he said, "You're lying. Those things aren't possible. That can't be right." And when somebody said that to me, the first thing I thought was how awful for him that he is so limited by other people's negative views that that's what he thinks, that he thinks it's impossible to work and write books and be autistic. But I also thought, I bet there's more than one of this person. I bet this is not an isolated incident. And I thought, if that's the case, and young people are getting a diagnosis young, and it's not translating into something positive, it's actually translating into something negative, I really want to do something to address that. And at that point, my advocacy career took off, and within a few months, I'd written another book, which was not about me. It was a book about employment for autistic teenagers, because I figured at that point in my journey that one of the most important things was for people to get employment that want employment. So I started talking about autism and employment. Through that, I started talking about autism and resilience, and things sort of took off. So between 2012 and now, I've written 10 more books.
Wow.
8 of them are available now for purchase, and 2 of them are in production. And I'm working on another one about employment and autism for young adults. So yeah, that 2012, that experience sort of drove me into a very passionate engagement with autism advocacy particularly. And it is a passion, it's a special interest, as they say,
Yes.
is around making things better for autistic people. And through that, through my experience as someone with schizophrenia and someone who's non-binary, I also do advocacy around gender and mental health. So I'm a Renaissance Yennsky. I have a lot of things that I do.
Love it. Oh, wow. That's amazing. That is so, I think a lot of autistic people can, they would really relate to that. And I think that's a really important issue as well, like autistic people in employment. That seems to be kind of more being broadcast now in the media. And what are your thoughts about how they're going about it, though, in terms of inclusion of autistic people in employment?
See, that's a really good question. There's a lot of programs out there for autistic people to get into the workforce, which is great. I have no issue with that. I think anything that helps autistic people gain meaningful, suitable, sustainable employment is a great thing. It's fine. I think it's a bit limited, though. I think having it just as special programs around neurodiversity and employment, I think it should be across the board. I don't think it should just be, here is this specific program to help autistic people be employed. I think all businesses should be thinking about this. And I think we need, as advocates, we need to promote the benefits of employing autistic people, because there are lots of benefits to employers for employing autistic people. And we need to build that understanding of how to do that well. Because if you get a good workplace relationship between managers and autistic staff, it's absolutely stunning. It is a great thing. It changes the world. It makes the business better, it makes life better for the autistic employee, it helps with diversity, it helps the employer become an employer of choice for people with disability more broadly, all of those things. If we're just limited to special programs, we're not going to get as many people employed, and we're not going to reach as many employers. And I think that's really important to get that employer engagement. I think some of the TV shows that they have around this are potentially quite problematic. And it's the same with the dating ones. It does seem to be a little bit of, oh, look at these weird people doing stuff that normal people do. And I'm not sure how helpful those actually are. I know people really enjoy them. And I know some autistic people are absolutely itching to get on to them. You know, they're really keen. I know somebody who wanted to go on the dating show and they were desperately keen. Whereas for me, I think that stuff's slightly icky. Actually, I do think there's some problems with those kinds of approaches. So yeah, I may be alone in that, but I find them quite.
I don't think so. I think I understand what you mean, because in a way, you know, the media portrays autism in a certain way, and I understand. I've read a lot about particular shows, like you say, that TV reality shows at the moment with autistic people, and I think in a way it's still very stereotypical. They're not, because if you've met, you know, there's a saying which you're probably aware of, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, and so it is a little bit yes, I don't know, like you say, icky to watch, because again, you know, I understand what they're trying to do, but then they're not capturing, you know, every woman, you know, women in particular that have autism, that don't have an intellectual disability. So anyway, thank you for that. That was really insightful. And you touched on before briefly about the books, and I love reading books myself. As I've said before, I've got lots and lots of books about autism to get through, but I'm really interested to know what are a couple of your favourite ones. Have you got any favourite?
I love Neurotribes is fantastic.
Yes, I've read that.
Yeah, and there's a number of really nice ones out there. There's Asperger's by Rudy Simone, which does have some problematic elements, but is quite good. In terms of autobiographies, there's a great one by my former mentor, Polly Samuel, called Nobody Nowhere. And that's one of the first autism books that ever came out by an autistic person, it's a great read. It's really good, and it inspired my autobiography. Wen Lawson and Beatrice Lawson have written one called Transitioning Together, which I absolutely love. And it's about their story around Wen transitioning gender. Wen is one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. I had the absolute privilege of writing a book with him, which was great. There's one called Uncomfortable Labels by Laura Kate Dale, which is it's another personal story about gender and sexuality and autism, which is really good. Who else has written a nice one? There are some good ones out there. There's Luke Jackson's Sex and Asperger's Syndrome. That's quite a good one. I could sit here and list autism books all day. In terms of videos, I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion. There's one with me in it called Alone in a Crowded Room that was on the ABC in 2010, and that's me, Wen Lawson, Akesha Temple and James Treffry, and that's pretty awesome. And
where can we view that, Yenn? Can we view that somewhere?
You can buy that one. I think it's $25, and it's from Sensible Films. So that's the website. So I think it's sensiblefilms.com.au, and it's called Alone in a Crowded Room. It's lovely. It was one of the first sort of big ticket things I did. And I should plug Emma Goodall's books, because Emma is awesome. I've co-authored a number of books with Emma. One's called Women on the Spectrum, which is really good, and that's sort of a across the life course for autistic women, sort of practical tips and things like that. And then there's Emma and Jane Nugent and me wrote the Guide to Good Mental Health on the Autism Spectrum, which is fantastic.
So would you recommend for an autistic woman that, especially, you know, in adulthood, that they've received a diagnosis, are there any books in particular that you would recommend that they read maybe first, like if they've just received a diagnosis, and especially to go through a lot of their life, you know, being in their 40s, 50s, 60s?
Yeah, I'd say Spectrum Women would probably be my go-to, which is edited by Barb Cook and has a chapter in by me and lots of chapters by other good people as well that aren't me. And yeah, that's a really good one. And then Emma and my one that I mentioned, Spectrum Women on the Spectrum, that one's pretty good too. If you're a non-binary or transgender person, I would recommend, I've even got a copy of it. Come here. Here we go. There we go. I would recommend that one, which is When Lawson and Me, the Autistic Trans Guide to Life. And if you're a transgender teen, you might have to wait until next year, but there is a book for you by Sam Rose and myself, which I think is going to be called The Awesome Autistic Go-To Guide for Trans Teens. So yeah.
That sounds so exciting and promising and really helpful, I could imagine, for autistic people that identify as non-binary, because I can't imagine that there is a lot out there at the moment.
There isn't at this point in time. My main publisher, which is Jessica Kingsley Publishers, are doing quite a lot of gender-related books, which is fantastic. They have a gender section. They have an editor who looks after gender diversity books, which is fantastic. In fact, when I pitched the idea of the teens book, the editor wrote back to me and said, "Oh, we were going to ask you to do that anyway."
Oh, there you go.
So yeah,
well, that was meant to be.
Yeah.
You talked briefly about employment, and speaking of books, this was one of the first books when I received my diagnosis that I am actually still reading myself, in between doing lots of other things. But you contributed a section in the book about positive employment, and I know you've touched on that briefly already, but what advice maybe could you offer autistic women on maybe even disclosing their autism diagnosis at their place of employment?
So disclosure is the question, isn't it? That's the big tricky one for anyone with an invisible disability. It's like, yeah, what do I say? Do I say anything? What's the best approach?
Yeah.
I think with disclosure, it's important to have a strategy. So have a think about whether you want to tell your employer, what you want to say, how much you want to say, when in the process do you want to say it? So do you say when you apply for the job, when you get the interview, when you start the job, a few weeks after you start the job? When do you do it? Who do you do it to? Do you tell your manager? Do you tell your big boss? Do you tell your colleagues? Do you tell some of your colleagues? So just thinking about these things, you might not actually end up using the strategy, but having a think about it is really helpful, I find. For me, I disclose by default because I have an international profile, so it's a bit difficult for me to keep it a secret. That being said, I find in my experience, generally, not always, generally, disclosing has been a really good thing, because it means if something isn't working, I can put my hand up and say, there's an issue, could we please work to resolve it? Whereas if I wasn't out loud and proud, it would be a lot more difficult to have that conversation. So if you say autism, managers think, oh, autism. If you say, I'm finding the noise in this office really difficult to cope with, they don't have a label to put on that. So they're like, oh, I don't know what to do about that. But if you say, I'm autistic and I'm finding the noise in the office is difficult, in their mind, hopefully, will pop up, oh, autism, we need to make a reasonable adjustment. So I do find, not always, but generally disclosure is a good approach, but it does depend on a number of factors, including your manager. You've got a really difficult manager, disclosing is not going to be the easiest thing. I remember years ago, I had a manager who was quite problematic. She was quite aggressive and didn't really like me very much, or I got the feeling she didn't really like me very much. And I'd given my director a copy of my autobiography because they'd asked to see it. And this senior manager had found out and wanted to read it. I remember thinking, oh, I really don't want to give her my autobiography, but I can't say no because, it's publicly available. And also I said, no, that would make things worse. Yeah. So lots of trepidation, left this book with this senior manager. 2 weeks later, I came back to work. The book was on my desk. There was no comment on it. And the manager treated me 1,000 times better than she had before. So that was really interesting because I thought this is going to be, I just assumed it was going to make the relationship worse, but actually it made the relationship better. So I guess don't be surprised to be surprised. Mm-hmm. I think that was really interesting. And then ever since then, that manager liked me and was really nice to me. It was, I should have lent it to her at the start of the relationship. Disclosure is a real tricky one. And I can't give advice specifically because I don't know your workplace. I don't know your managers. I don't know the dynamic in the workplace. So it really is about using your judgment, and sometimes it's about taking risks.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was really good advice, especially for a lot of newly diagnosed autistic women as well. Can you share, I know something else that you do, so this is where, great minds think alike, that you also offer a support group in Canberra. So can you just share with us a little bit about, about your support group and how it works and, all the lovely autistic women that come along?
I've been facilitating the Canberra Autism Women's Group since 2011. My mailing list has over 150 people on it. Don't worry, they don't all turn up. It's basically an informal sort of support group for autistic women and non-binary folks. And we have a meeting every 2 weeks. So last year, we couldn't have face-to-face because of COVID. So we started doing it by Zoom. And so many people liked doing it by Zoom that they asked if we could have a regular Zoom catch-up in addition to the face-to-face catch-up. So it's every 2 weeks now. So the first week is in person and the second one is in via Zoom. At the moment, we're in lockdown in the ACT, so it's all via Zoom. But hopefully we'll be out of lockdown soon so we can go back to the face-to-face meetings. But it's a lovely group. I did win an award on the strength of facilitating the group, which was lovely. That was the ACT Volunteer of the Year Award in 2016. It's very popular with the people that come along. A lot of people say it's one of the best things they do. We sort of start by going around the room or going around the Zoom and seeing how everyone, introducing ourselves and also saying one positive thing that happened in the previous week. Yes. And then we get into a discussion and we talk about all sorts of things. I do have a list of topics, but I never actually have to refer to it because someone's always got something they want to raise. And we have people from all over the world. It's lovely. It's a really lovely group. We do have cats attending as well via Zoom, which is always good.
Yeah, wow. And what would you say to an autistic woman that's maybe looking for a support group or, not sure, if they get a bit nervous about coming, what kind of advice could you give to mum?
I'd say get in touch with the facilitator and introduce yourself and ask any questions you might have. Mm-hmm. If it's my group, I would tell people it's a very safe group. It's intended to be supportive and a safe place. I'd say have a look online as well. There's some really good groups online. Can I think of any? Tara, the Autistic Realm, and the Siblinghood is very good. There's an Australian women's and non-binary people's Facebook group, which I can't remember the name of it, but it's also very good.
Yeah. It's good to
And
know,
yeah,
I guess, that there's support groups out there, like, what you offer and what I offer, and really just, we're just trying to help autistic women, and and offer that support, which like we were saying before, that you quite often you receive a diagnosis, and you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s or beyond, and then it's like, okay, catch up, and then you're left with a whole lot of questions. And so that's what I find in the support group that I offer as well, that women really like to connect. Autistic women like to connect and
absolutely.
share their stories, and just feel that they're not alone.
Yeah. I think that's very true. And I think it's really important to connect with other autistic people because, we do get along best with our family, It's
Our
it's
tribe.
really have that connection. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And one other thing I just wanted to mention was your TEDx talk that you did in Canberra. I've watched that and I loved it. I think you injected a lot of humour into it, and I could see that the audience was, really responding well to that. And also the way that you talked about advocacy for neurodiversity, and incorporating resilience into, an autistic life and way of life. What are your reflective thoughts on when you did the TEDx talk, and what kind of came of it?
I needed a lot of resilience to do the TEDx talk. It was utterly terrifying. It's the scariest talk I've ever done in my life. I actually was so anxious the day before that I thought I would get up on stage and forget how to speak English. You can't tell that from the talk. I think I did it very well. And once I got into it, I was I'm stressed about a talk. Once I actually get into it, it ceases to be as stressful as it started out. But in fact, I actually, and you can't use PowerPoint slides in a TED talk. They're very, very firm on that. But when I give talks on PowerPoint, I have 3 slides. The first 3 slides, I have the title slide, which is the title of the talk, about Yenn, and then some photos of me doing my thing. And so I figure if I'm anxious, by the time I get to that 3rd slide, that none of those slides are difficult. So by the time I get to the 3rd slide, I should be into it. And I do find that once I actually get going, I'm okay. But TEDx was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. I remember, so I was in the 3rd bracket. So I was after lunch. So I had the 1st bracket, morning tea, 2nd bracket, lunch, 3rd bracket, afternoon tea. And so in the afternoon tea and lunch, it was fine. I just walked around. No one knew who I was. It was great. After my talk, I wanted to get an orange juice from the bar, and I could not get to the bar because everyone was saying, hey, yeah, awesome talk. It was wonderful. You did so well. Utterly
because I guess
overwhelmed.
they've connected. They've heard you speak, and they've put a name to the face, and they've heard part of your story, and you've built that kind of connection with them, or they feel like they've built the connection with you, but then you haven't met each individual person. So
it was just lovely. I've still got the t-shirt that I wore. I've still got that t-shirt. So sometimes I break out the TEDx t-shirt, which is good. It's actually, it's really nice. It's from one of those online, like Redbubble or Threadless or something like that. And it's a picture of a city with a tree growing out of it and little stars. And actually, if you're in complete darkness, not that I was at TEDx, but if you are, the stars glow in the dark. So it was quite cool. Most of the female presenters wore long dresses and stuff like that. But I thought, I don't wear long dresses. I'm going to wear jeans and a t-shirt. So I did.
That's amazing. They should have dimmed the lights. So then, they just see you.
You know what? The only thing on stage with me was lights, and in front of me there was a little monitor, and it didn't have my notes or anything helpful like that. It had the time counting down to when I had to get off stage.
Oh no.
TEDx is terrifying. It's awesome. I would do it again in a heartbeat. If any TEDx people contact me and say, would you like to do another one? I'll be like, yes. But it was a big deal. I loved it. The other talk I gave was a couple of years after that.
Yeah.
And that was in Melbourne, for an autism parents organisation. And Temple Grandin and Tim Sharp, who created Late Speak Man, were the other speakers. So they were famous. I wasn't famous. I think I was the colour and light, but we all got an hour to speak. And I talked, it was just my life story. So I talked about my life story. My parents were in the front row. I made the mistake of looking at them at one point and then thought, don't do that. And at the end of my talk, I got a standing ovation from 1,500 people.
Oh
It
my
was
gosh.
amazing.
I
It was
just
on
want
a
to
pub.
know, how do you talk for an hour on a
Oh,
stage?
I can talk for an hour. I could talk for 2 hours. No one
Oh,
would
wow.
sit around to listen to it. But yeah, I love talking. One of my favourite things is giving presentations. I was just saying this morning, yay, I'm doing a podcast, woohoo! And yes, I do enjoy the sound of my own voice.
Just had a thought. A lot of women do suffer from anxiety, like myself, and that quite often mental health conditions come before an autism diagnosis. So I think what you said then, I mean, you don't have to be going on a stage and presenting for it to trigger anxiety, but I just had a thought, that's something that probably a lot of autistic women can relate to, is what triggers their anxiety. And quite often it is, leading up to something where most of the anxiety will be felt. Have you had other issues with anxiety where you've I'm just thinking maybe there's some advice that you could offer, in terms of anxiety with autism, and how maybe some things that you have done to help yourself?
Yeah, I have big issues with anxiety. I actually have 6 brain-related diagnoses. So I've got schizophrenia, autism, ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and cluster B personality traits. So I have 6. I know, whenever they were handing this stuff out, I kept going to the back of the queue. I just didn't understand how it worked. Anyway, so I do have generalized anxiety disorder. And so I worry about the most silly things. I worry about the internet dropping out. I worry about the virus protection not working. I worry about home maintenance and all these things that aren't actually things that most people worry about unless there's a reason to. And I worry about them for no good reason, just because my brain likes to worry. And in my experience, being really anxious, really heightened anxiety, can turn into psychosis. So I have to be very careful with anxiety. I've recently gone on a medication which has really helped address my anxiety. So that's been really good. And that's just a low dose of an antidepressant. And that has had more of an impact on my anxiety than anything before. So I'm really happy about that. That's a relatively recent thing, and it's a good thing. I do find, for me, deep breathing and mindfulness meditation helps a lot. Also trying to be logical and say, look, is this actually, what is the worst thing that can happen if this goes wrong? What is the absolute worst outcome? Also distraction. So if I'm anxious, focusing on something I enjoy doing, or just something I need to do, clean the house, watch TV, go to work, all of those things. And I do find that distraction can be very helpful with anxiety, and to acknowledge that anxiety is real. And it's not, some people say, oh, it's just anxiety. It is not just anxiety. It's debilitating. It's horrible. It makes life difficult for a variety of reasons for different people. So we do need to acknowledge that. And people need to stop dismissing people's mental health concerns. The other thing that gets me is when people say, oh, I'm so OCD. OCD does not just mean you like a tidy house. OCD is a genuine diagnosis of an serious anxiety disorder, and people that do have it, it is quite debilitating and difficult to manage, and it's not a good thing. And to sort of dismiss it by saying, oh, I'm so OCD, is really annoying.
Yeah. And especially when you're autistic as well. I find that apart from my anxiety, I also suffer from a lot of chronic health conditions, like fibromyalgia, Ehlers-Danlos, which is joint hypermobility, which is a collagen disorder, and autonomic dysfunction, which is POTS. So I am learning now that I'm aware that I'm autistic, I think it's important for women, especially that have chronic health conditions, is to really incorporate self-care, because and understanding and knowing what your triggers are, like you say, you know, so if you're starting to feel anxious, it's that self-awareness which I think develops over time. Well, I've found in my personal experience anyway.
Definitely.
Yeah. So to finish off, I just wanted to know if you had any advice that you could give, you know, if you're a woman on the spectrum and you've recently been diagnosed, yeah, just any advice that you could offer.
Okay, well, I would say join some autism-related groups, either online or in person would be really good. Meet some other autistic people, read some books and read some blogs. There's a bunch of really good blogs out there. If you go on my website, which is yennpurkis.com, right at the end, there's a link which is links and other resources or something like that. And it's got a whole bunch of different blogs and resources which are really useful for autistic people.
Fantastic.
So I would recommend having a look there. And yeah, watch some TED Talks. There's a bunch of autistic people that have given TED Talks. There's Jude Morrow in Northern Ireland. There's Jack Den Hooting.
Yes.
There's, what's her name? Dawn Joy Leong. There's me. There's, of course, the I Can Network, because Chris Varney did a wonderful one. And yeah, I'm sure there's others that I've forgotten. But yeah, check out some of those. Listen to some podcasts, watch some good autism related content. There's actually a wonderful thing in Melbourne, on Channel 31 called Bent TV, and Jackie Pillar does a segment on that, and often has neurodivergent people and gender diverse people, so that's worth checking out. So that's Bent TV, Channel 31. And what else?
Fantastic. No, that's really good advice. That's really good advice, because I think quite often it can be an overwhelming experience if you've lived so much of your life not understanding why you feel a bit different, and to receive that autism diagnosis can be so validating and liberating, but it can also be overwhelming, because then people don't understand if you have autism and they say, you know, you don't look autistic. So then it's also about sharing or telling your story to family members and other people, and education. So yeah, so I think, like you say, find your tribe, find some really good information, and find a support group like what we both offer, and which will help grow your excuse me, self-confidence and understanding. Definitely. Yeah, excellent. Well, that was really good. Thank you so much, Yenn. I really appreciated everything that we shared and talked about today. And for further information on Yenn's work, like Yenn has mentioned, please visit yennpurkis.com. Thank you so much, Yenn.
Thank you.
Bye.